Hey guys, welcome back to part 2 of Murder and Missing Organs. What's going on with the Alabama prison? If you haven't listened to part 1, please do so because I'm just going to pick up where I left off. We were in the middle of the Department of Justice findings. Now, if you hang on throughout all the findings, some of it's kind of boring, and the stories, at the end, I'm going to try to dig into the mystery of where all of those organs went. So, let's get started. Please note that the content of this recording may contain graphic material, including torture, and explicit language may be used. The opinions are of my own and may be offensive to some listeners. They are my opinions. Everyone has them, and if you do not agree, then ignore them like an adult and move on. Listener discretion is strongly advised. Hey Ravens, welcome to the Ravens Knock. I'm your host, Amy. I want to thank you guys for liking, sharing, and subscribing, and also referring your friends. If you're not a premium member, you can do so for $7 a month, which is like a cup of coffee. It does help the show out as podcasting is not free. And you get ad-free content, bonus episodes that no one else gets. And with that said, let's go ahead and get started. In December 2016, a prisoner at Bullock asked a lieutenant for help, reporting that several prisoners had threatened to stab him. The lieutenant took the prisoner to the captain's office. While talking to the captain, the prisoner raised his voice but was not aggressive. Without warning, the lieutenant grabbed the prisoner by the arm and the prisoner began resisting. The captain and lieutenant took the prisoner to the floor and eventually handcuffed him. The captain then shoved the prisoner's head to the floor. Several correction officers also punched the prisoner in the back and choked him with a baton. The warden requested that I&I review the matter. The officers falsely denied striking or choking the prisoner. Approximately 1 year later, I&I concluded that the prisoner's allegations of excessive force were substantiated. It is unclear whether I&I referred the matter to a local district attorney. Corrective action was initiated against the captain, but records provided by ADOC did not specify what type of action was taken. In October 2016, a correctional officer at St. Clair opened a tray door to handcuff a prisoner for escort to the shower. The prisoner stabbed the correction officer in the hand with a prison-made knife. The officer stepped back and sprayed the prisoner in the face with a chemical agent through the tray door. He then secured the tray door and called for his supervisor. A sergeant arrived with another correctional officer at the scene and handcuffed the prisoner without incident. While the sergeant and other officers were escorting the prisoner to the healthcare unit, at least 6 other correctional officers rushed towards the prisoner, screaming that the prisoner would not be allowed just to be taken to the infirmary. One of the accompanying officers described the scene as a mob of officers. A lieutenant saw the situation and tried to intervene to calm the officers. The sergeant ordered the correctional officers to stand down, stating, "It's over. The inmate is in handcuffs." The sergeant next felt a burst of chemical spray hit the side of his face, which caused him to turn the prisoner around and place him up against the wall. The sergeant instructed another officer to continue the escort, and then witnessed 3 correctional officers tackle the prisoner to the ground before beating him with a baton and closed fists. The lieutenant also witnessed the beating and stomping of the prisoner while ordering everyone to stop. During the scuffle, the lieutenant was inadvertently hit in the thigh by one of the officer's batons. When the sergeant attempted to regain control of the prisoner, he was pushed back by one of the officers and the beating resumed. I&I investigated and referred the matter to the local district attorney for possible criminal prosecution. The documents ADOC provided us do not show that discipline was imposed. Correctional officers unlawfully use force as punishment or retribution. ADOC's correctional officers often use force to punish prisoners when prisoners' response or behavior may not act accordingly. with the officer's commands, even though the prisoner does not physically resist or present a reasonably perceived threat to others. In some prisons, it's common for officers to slap prisoners with a little justification as a form of punishment. At times, officers are even more forceful. These uses of force are excessive and unlawful. See Thomas 614 F 3D at 1307, holding that if force is used for the very purpose of punishment or harm, that use satisfies the Eighth Amendment's objective harm requirement. The following examples illustrate these violations. In November 2018, a correctional officer at Bullock instructed several prisoners to leave the kitchen area. One prisoner disregarded the order and walked through the dining line a second time to get additional food. The prisoner was not demonstrating violent or threatening behavior at this time. Regardless, the correctional officer struck the prisoner twice with a wooden baton in the arm and in the back. A lieutenant observed the assault and escorted the officer to the shift office. He also stated he was stressed from having worked 12-hour days for 10 of the preceding 11 days. The officer stated that he would have hit the prisoner even if the warden had been standing nearby. I referred the matter to the local district attorney's office for potential prosecution. The documents ADOC provided us do not show that discipline was imposed. In October 2018, a prisoner was involved in an altercation with several other prisoners in his dormitory at Ventress. The prisoner ran from the dormitory seeking assistance. An officer instructed the prisoner to return to his dormitory because the institution was on lockdown for prisoner physicals. The prisoner expressed fear for his safety and asked the officer not to force him to return to his dormitory. At that point, a sergeant approached the prisoner, yelled at him, slapped him in the face with an open hand. A program counselor witnessed the assault and noted that the prisoner was not resisting at any time. During an interview with I&I, the sergeant denied ever striking the prisoner, but I&I substantiated the incident. I&I subsequently opted not to refer the incident to the local district attorney, but it also failed altogether to conduct an administrative review of the matter. The sergeant was arrested in December 2018 for facilitating delivery of smuggled contraband to prisoners. In May 2018, a prisoner at St. Clair informed a correctional captain that a sergeant had assaulted him. The sergeant failed to complete an incident report, did not permit the prisoner to go to the infirmary to secure a body chart, and initially falsely claimed that no contact had occurred with the prisoner. The confrontation originated over the prisoner's clothing. The sergeant stated that the prisoner was nude from the waist down, but the prisoner argued that he was wearing shorts that were covered by his t-shirt. The officer also claimed that the prisoner was in possession of contraband, which was a metallic coffee cup. The prisoner told I&I that the officer punched him 4 or 5 times, and a body chart from the following day showed swelling to the right side of the prisoner's nose, bruising around both eyes, a scrape on the left side of his nose, and a small scrape on his right middle finger. But the I&I investigative report concluded that the sergeant slapped the prisoner. The officer received a 3-day suspension for failing to report the incident and for using excessive force. In January 2018, a correctional officer at Stanton used force after a prisoner refused instruction to take a stretcher to a dormitory. The prisoner informed the officer that he could not take the stretcher to the dormitory because he was following a captain's prior order. According to the officer, the prisoner refused an order to place his hands behind his back, and a scuffle ensued. The prisoner claimed the officer slammed him into a door and hit him in the face 3 times with little provocation. The officer then handcuffed the prisoner. A captain reviewed the incident and concluded that the incident could have been avoided and that it escalated unnecessarily due to the provocation by the officer. The documents ADOC provided does not show that discipline was imposed. In July 2017, a corrections officer at Kilby observed a prisoner working in the kitchen give some leftover chicken to another prisoner. The officer ordered the kitchen worker to report back to the back of the kitchen and force him to eat all the leftover chicken as the officer and lieutenant watched. The prisoner told the captain that the officer slapped him 3 times because he could not eat all of the chicken. When the captain questioned the lieutenant and officer about the incident, they admitted to forcing the prisoner to eat the chicken. It is unclear whether additional force was used on the prisoner. Correction officers use chemical spray inappropriately. ADOC's regulation governing the use of chemical agents generally provides that they may be deployed in order to gain control of a situation, but ADOC correctional officers often ignore ADOC's regulation and use chemical spray inappropriately. Prisoners who do not present a danger are frequently sprayed with chemical agents. In those cases, officers seem to punish prisoners for not complying with a verbal order. Chemical spray is regularly used for retribution. These kinds of applications of chemical agents violate the Constitution, where chemical agents are used unnecessarily without penological justification or for the very purpose of punishment or harm. That use satisfies the Eighth Amendment's objective harm requirement. Thomas 614 F3D at 1311 examples include: in January 2018, a prisoner at Staten disobeyed a correctional officer's order to close the door to his dormitory. When the prisoner refused, the officer sprayed the prisoner in the face with a chemical agent and hit the prisoner several times on the legs with a baton. The captain concluded that the use of force was not justified and recommended that corrective action be taken against the officer. The documents ADOC provided us do not show that discipline was imposed. In August 2017, a prisoner at Holman pushed against his cell door trying to open it. A corrections officer instructed the prisoner to step away from the door several times, but the prisoner refused. The officer then administered a chemical agent through the tray door to the prisoner's genital area, even though the prisoner posed no threat. The captain concluded that the use of force was not justified, as it was not ADOC policy to administer chemical agents to an individual's underwear. The documents ADOC provided us do not show that discipline was imposed. It also is common for officers in Alabama's prisons to use chemical sprays on prisoners in locked cells. These uses of force often occur when prisoners place their arm in a tray door, even though the prisoners are secure in a cell and pose no danger to others. Rather than contacting a supervisor before spraying a chemical agent, officers frequently use chemical spray on prisoners in these circumstances. ADOC lacks accountability in reviewing uses of force. In 2015, ADOC issued a regulation governing the use of force within Alabama's prisons. In broad terms, the regulation permits force to be used in various enumerated instances, including the self-defense, to protect others or property, to quell a disturbance, or when a prisoner exercises physical resistance to a lawful command. While ADOC's use of force regulation is relatively robust, it is not effectively implemented or consistently enforced by correctional supervisors. It is often ignored by correctional officers. Whenever use of force occurs within an Alabama prison, a warden or a captain is required to conduct an initial investigation. The institution-level use of force investigation may include interviewing correctional officers, prisoners, and witnesses, and reviewing documents or surveillance footage when available. The investigating official usually makes a finding as to whether the use of force was excessive and evaluates whether additional action should occur. These findings and recommendations are then forwarded to the head warden, who then has discretion to refer the matter to I&I for further review. ADOC's regulation requires that a prison's head warden notify I&I and request further investigation if there is reason to believe that use of force was not justified. This system vests wardens with far too much discretion in determining whether a use of force should receive further scrutiny by I&I. Indeed, oftentimes wardens opt to address uses of force through administrative sanctions or discipline rather than reinforcing a matter to INI. The application of ADOC's use of force regulation is complicated by the fact that some prisons have established their own standard operating procedures which specify when force may be used. These policy generally bans excessive force, but they are often inconsistent from prison to prison, and their particulars and sometimes conflict with ADOC's own use of force regulation. For instance, ADOC's regulation generally allows physical force to be used only after attempts to de-escalate a situation have proven unsuccessful. But the standard operating procedures at some prisons, including Bullock, Easterling, and Ventris, contain no such requirement. Additionally, some prisons' standard operating procedures allow chemical agents to be dispersed to enforce institutional rules, while other prisons allow such force only when a prisoner physically resists a lawful command. This may lead to scenarios where one prison's policy permits force while another prison's policy prohibits it in the same scenario. ADOC does not routinely review uses of force to identify officers who may have a history or a pattern of excessive force allegations, nor does ADOC have a centralized system to track officers who are repeatedly investigated for using force. Such a centralized review could also assist operations and intelligence in determining which prisons, units within a particular prison, or shifts within a particular prison have higher rates of uses of force. It could also help ADOC identify potentially problematic officers. Most importantly, it could help ADOC formulate remedial measures and changes to policy and practices that would prevent the use of excessive force in the future. ADOC employees often fail to document or report uses of force. It is especially troubling that supervisors often fail to document, investigate, otherwise address uses of force, demonstrating a deliberate indifference to the harms to prisoners caused by the use of excessive force. In some instances, surveillance video reveals unreported uses of force, while in others, officers admit using force after an inquiry from a supervisor. On other occasions, correctional officers, sometimes including supervisory officers, falsify reports related to uses of force. One former corrections officer informed us that in a facility to which he was assigned, some nurses help correctional officers ensure that injuries caused by uses of force are concealed and are not properly documented on body charts. In one incident at Bullock, a prisoner was taken to the floor, handcuffed, kicked, and stumped in the head by at least 3 correctional officers. Over 1 month over the incident, the prisoner was taken to an outside hospital for treatment of his injuries. Additionally, the incident reports were frequently written to contain minimal or no description of the injuries experienced as a result of force. For example, one prisoner at Bibb sustained fractures to both arms after an officer hit him with a baton. The incident report indicates that the prisoner was taken to the healthcare unit, but altogether fails to document the extent of the injuries. In a separate incident at Donaldson, officers used force on a prisoner who had assaulted a corrections officer. The prisoner was subsequently transferred to Kilby for medical treatment, where providers photographed the injuries, documented an eye that was swollen shut, and multiple open wounds to his face. The injuries were so severe that he was transferred to an outside hospital. Despite this, there was no incident report indicating that use of force occurred. In failing to properly document uses of force and any resulting injuries, ADOC employees circumvent accountability. Uses of force are frequently not investigated by INI. Referrals to INI do not always result in a use of force investigation. In many instances, INI did not open an investigation even though a correctional supervisor, such as a captain or an assistant warden, conducted an institution-level use of force investigation and recommended a referral to INI for possible criminal prosecution. It is unclear why INI failed to open an investigation in most of these scenarios. It is possible that the head warden overruled the investigating supervisor's recommendation and failed to refer the matter to INI. But in many instances, an INI supervisory agent decided not to pursue an investigation after a warden referred a matter. Additionally, ADOC has not devoted sufficient resources to reviewing uses of force. For instance, in 2017, ADOC employees documented over 1,800 incidents related to uses of force that occurred throughout the men's prisons. Of that number, a captain or warden recommended that IUI review around 35 cases. But INI only opened approximately 14 investigations into its uses of force in 2017. Wow. So 14 out of 1,800. In other words, INI reviewed only 40% the use of force incident that a warden or captain referred for a possible criminal prosecution, and several of the investigations from 2017 remained open in 2020. Really don't know how they got that. Uses of excessive force are inadequately addressed by ADOC. ADOC tends to address uses of excessive force initially through corrective action as part of the institution's disciplinary process. ADOC rarely suspends or dismisses correctional officers for uses of excessive force where such action would be warranted. During the course of our investigation, we issued a subpoena for documentations related to discipline or investigations of correctional officers for excessive force, as well as other improprieties such as extortion, robbery, sexual abuse, smuggling of contraband. ADOC produced the documentations identifying 97 disciplinary actions, mostly from 2016 and 2017. Nearly half of the disciplinary recommendations during that time related to correctional officers' late arrival to work or failure to show up for work. During those 2 years, ADOC considered suspending or dismissing only one employee for excessive force. In that incident, a lieutenant at Donaldson witnessed an officer stomping a prisoner on the back of the head as the prisoner was laying face down. As mentioned in this notice, ADOC witnessed other instances of excessive force, and based on the documentation provided, very few of those resulted in suspension or dismissal. ADOC provided limited documentation of discipline other than the suspension or dismissal in the form of unspecified corrective actions that are imposed against officers who use excessive force. That documentation failed to specify the type of corrective action taken, but it could include minor forms of discipline such as informal counseling, warnings, and written reprimands. As documented in this letter, ADOC witnessed instances of excessive force that merited significant discipline. However, we found numerous instances where no such discipline was imposed. Correctional supervisor within ADOC lack accountability on how they exercise disciplinary authority. Wardens and correctional supervisors often opt not to refer matters to INI and address uses of force through corrective actions. ADOC refused to provide documentation to us about what corrective action means and the type of corrective action that was imposed in specific instances where unjustified force was used. Despite these corrective actions, excessive force occurs regularly throughout most of Alabama's prison for men. Further, the internal prison-by-prison handling of findings of unlawful force makes it more difficult to track potentially abusive officers who transfer to other prisons. It also makes it difficult for the commissioner and his top officials to determine whether a particular prison or warden is addressing its uses of excessive force consistently, fairly, and effectively. And because of the warden's decisions to take corrective action are not reviewed, ADOC's system enables any warden who wants to avoid leadership scrutiny to do so by refusing to refer incidents to INI. This lack of accountability ultimately results in a failure to correct underlying problems that contribute to the continued uses of excessive force. We therefore have good reason to believe that the disciplinary system within ADOC is ineffective while combating uses of excessive force. While ADOC only provided us with partial data from the first 4 months of 2018, the agency was on pace to exceed the number of uses of force from 2017. In the first quarter of 2018, INI opened more investigations into uses of force than the entire prior year. Only in the first quarter. The agency produced documentation for 31 closed 2018 INI investigations that were conducted in Alabama's prisons. Based on that documentation, we identified several instances where INI substantiated excessive force, but most were not referred for criminal prosecution. Use of force investigations are frequently inadequate. We thoroughly reviewed a substantial number of institution-based use of force investigations, as well as dozens of INI investigations related to uses of force. Based on the documents provided to us, we concluded that both types of investigation into uses of force are often inadequate. The failure to rigorously and properly investigate uses of force fosters an environment where the use of excessive force is not addressed. Many uses of force investigation conducted by captains or wardens at the institutional level contain numerous problems. In some prisons, these institutional investigations rarely document what, if any, investigation steps have been taken. For an example, a significant number of those investigations fail to identify whether any officers, prisoners, or other subjects had been interviewed, and frequently they do not list the prisoners or the staff who were present and might have witnessed the incident. In other prisons, such as Holloman and Bibb, findings in those use of force investigations are frequently copied directly from an incident report's narrative, suggesting that the investigator simply adopts whatever was documented in the incident report with little or no further inquiry. At times, institution-level investigations are not conducted even though serious inquiries resulted from the use of force. For instance, in May 2017, a lieutenant at Easterling took a handcuffed prisoner to the ground face down. The incident report clearly states that force was used and includes statements from 2 other correctional officers who witnessed the incident. The prisoner was initially taken to a local hospital. The injuries were so serious, however, that the prisoner was subsequently transferred to a hospital over 150 miles away and treated for a broken hip. We saw no indication that the institution conducted a use of force investigation. Similarly, some INI investigations are also inadequate and contain minimal documentation. For an example, very few INI files contain surveillance video related to the incident under investigation, even at the facilities where video was available. This is a grave weakness in ADOC's ability to monitor activity and to determine what occurred before, during, or after a use of force. In a significant number of INI investigative files provided to us, medical assessments or body charts were absent, and there was no documentation effort to determine if the injuries sustained were consistent with the officer's description of the events. Additionally, many INI investigative files contain a description of an incident consisting of the duty officer's report and a narrative consisting of less than 1/3 of a page. This description is often copied from the incident report. There is little indication in these files that any subsequent review occurred. In many instances, INI supervisory agents refer a use of force matter back to a warden for further review, but the reason for such referrals was not provided to us. Once an INI supervisor referred a matter back to a warden, we were unable to identify a single instance that later underwent further INI review. In other scenarios, the INI investigative files consist only of an incident report. Those files fail to contain photographs, body charts, and there's no indication that interviews were conducted. In each of these scenarios, INI failed to document any conclusion as to whether force was justified. INI also closes a significant number of administrative investigations prematurely. This occurs at times due to a prisoner's lack of cooperation or when a prisoner is released from incarceration while an investigation is ongoing. There are a number of reasons why a prisoner may refuse to cooperate with the use of force investigation, such as fear of a retaliation. While a victim's failure to cooperate makes the investigation difficult, it is not an appropriate reason for closing an investigation. INI investigators sometimes take a few steps to interview potential witnesses as part of their investigation. For example, INI determined that a prisoner was serving time for committing a crime against a relative of a correctional officer. The prisoner was housed at the same prison as the correctional officer. Upon learning this, ADOC made arrangements to transfer the prisoner to another prison to protect the prisoner from harm. Before the transfer occurred, the prisoner alleged that when the officer discovered the reason for his incarceration, the officer choked him and banged his head against a gate until he lost consciousness. The prisoner requested that medical providers complete a body chart, but one was not obtained until approximately 2 weeks later. Despite the officer's refusal to cooperate with the investigation, INI found all the allegations of the force to be unfounded and closed the matter. INI did not take steps to interview other individuals who may have been able to substantiate the prisoner's allegations. In addition, INI has a practice of recording interviews by audio. The audio recordings, however, frequently do not contain all of the discussions about the incident. Before the audio recording begins, INI investigators have undocumented discussions with the witness about the allegations, which they then reference during the recorded interview. On some occasions, it appears that the undocumented discussion is used to guide the witness's answer in the recorded interview. Finally, INI has a small number of internal affair investigators who focus exclusively on reviewing matters for potential administrative sanctions or discipline. These internal affairs investigators only proceed after INI investigation into criminal conduct is completed and only review matters that are not criminal in nature, such as misapplication of ADOC policy. ADOC informed us that it did not conduct a single administrative investigation into the use of a force incident from 2017 and 2018, but we identified several files that appeared to be administrative in nature. Conditions that contribute to the use of excessive force, the severe levels of overcrowding and understaffing, contribute to the systemic use of excessive force. Since we issued our 2019 notice letter, the overcrowding within Alabama's prison has actually increased. In addition, and as we noted in our April 2019 notice letter, ADOC is critically understaffed, and even now, ADOC remains critically understaffed. Many of Alabama's prisons have staffing rate below 50%, and several facilities, staffing levels are well below that number. ADOC still needs to hire approximately 2,000 correction officers to adequately staff its men's prisons. ADOC is aware of the severe staffing deficiency, yet has not taken meaningful steps or other emergency measures to address the understaffing. In these conditions, security staff are regularly required to work long overtime hours and extra shifts. This leads to officers being tired, stressed, overworked, and angry. These officers can find it difficult to maintain a calm professional approach in these situations requiring de-escalation. Additionally, these conditions lead officers to feel outnumbered by prisoners and improperly resort to uses of force without justification, believing such disproportionate responses are the only effective method for maintaining safety and security. One former Alabama prison warden said without adequate staffing, officers feel like they have no backup or support when they face violent situations. In these situations, force is more likely to be used without adequate justification. ADOC's severe understaffing can place officers in unnecessary danger, and in situations where, while a use of force may be justified, it could have been avoided. And while some uses of force in those situations may be justified, uses of excessive force are not. The high levels of contraband weapons in Alabama prisons also heightens the correctional officer's sense of danger, even when they lack particularized evidence that a prisoner presents a danger. The officer's generalized fear for their own safety may lead them to use more force than is necessary and appropriate in cases where no such threat is present. Thus, by failing to adequately staff its prisons, Alabama is contributing to the dangerous conditions that give rise to the uses of excessive force. These conditions, combined with the lack of grievance system for prisoners or a central way to track repeated allegations of uses of force against particular correctional officers, increases the likelihood that there are officers who are repeatedly using excessive force with little or no repercussions. Uses of force are so commonplace in Alabama prisons that officers, even supervisors, watch other officers brutally beating prisoners and do not intervene. Throughout our investigation, we identified numerous examples of officers standing by and watching serious uses of excessive force occur and never speaking up or physically intervening. Uses of force happen so regularly in Alabama's prisons that some officers appear accustomed to that level of violence and consider it normal. In short, Alabama prisons' cruel treatment of prisoners by staff is common, and de-escalation techniques are regularly ignored. Last year, an inmate's family was notified that their loved one was delivered to the funeral home but was missing all of his major organs. 5 months later, it happened again when the family had asked a private pathologist to do an autopsy. The University of Alabama at Birmingham Hershey School of Medicine is one of the top schools for medical research and education. They have a contract with ADOC to do autopsies, and that includes consent for the removal of organs or tissues for the diagnostic or other testing, including final disposition. The UAB only conducts autopsies after obtaining consent or authorization from state officials. Now, this is where it gets hairy. The ADOC says it does not authorize nor conduct autopsies. The Chief Deputy Commissioner of Corrections stated on the stand in court that only 4 entities can authorize an autopsy: the Governor, Attorney General, District Attorney, or a Circuit Court Judge. Keep that in your back pocket. So when asked why the ADOC had contracts with UAB, he stated he didn't know. The attorney stated that he had called himself an expert in ADOC policies, but yet he lacked any knowledge of them. Burnt. So when an inmate passes, the Alabama Department of Forensics comes and they pick the body up, and then it's transferred over to the place of autopsy or a funeral home, depending on several factors like if the death was unlawful, suspicious, or unnatural. According to UAB, they have an autopsy authorization form, and that form also empowers a warden to give consent without limitations. Now remember, according to the commissioner, they don't give any authorizations. They only come for those 4 entities. Several lawsuits have been filed in regards to loved ones' organs being taken without the family's consent. But through my investigation, I found out that prison wardens are giving consent and not the family. In 2021, Alabama passed a law that requires medical examiners to notify the next of kin if they would be retaining a deceased person's organs to determine their ID or the cause or manner of death. They also need approval from the next of kin to keep organs for research or other purposes. Now, if you violate that, there's a bill going through legislature that would make it a Class C felony, which you can get up to 10 years in the can for that. One family hired a pathologist, and they had called the UAB to get the autopsy report, but they were told that it's got to be released to the ADOC because he was a ward of the state, which is crazy. But she contacted the ADOC and got it, and on that report, guess who signed off on the authorization? Yep, you get it right. It's the warden. Another family who requested their family members' organs be returned said that they're thinking about exhuming their loved one to see if the organs that were even returned belong to them. In April, 5 lawsuits have been filed so far. When one family called to get their family members' organs back, they were told that UAB was a teaching hospital and all teaching hospitals that do autopsies keep their organs. In case of the funeral director, he had called the family to tell them that preparing the body for viewing was going to be difficult because when he received the body, it was very decomposed to a point to where it had severe skin slippage and that the organs were missing, along with the brain. Another family had a family member sent to the funeral home that was decomposing, and the body had severe bruising and swelling across the neck and head, so they decided to hire an outside pathologist to do another autopsy and found out that he was missing his heart. Now, UAB denied having it. In fact, they denied ever having his body. But now they're the ones that gets the bodies from the prison. ADOC stated that he was intact when he left the prison, but had no idea exactly where he went when he left. And when in court, no one knows where this man's heart is. The judge dismissed the case without prejudice, which means in the future it can be retried. But this is unbelievable. Someone needs to be held accountable. In my opinion, I think it should be the prisons, as they're the ones that's signing off on it. But UAB should be ashamed, knowing that they are taking organs without the knowledge of the victims' families. That's just immoral. Someone loved that person. That's someone's dad, someone's husband, son, and brother. Would you want somebody doing that to your loved one? As of April 2024, UAB terminated their contract with ADOC. And as for Daniel Williams, who was murdered, which that murder could have easily been prevented by having inmate X be in a higher area of security or just not even being out in general population. I hope his father gets justice. And I will say this, if we fail to punish him here on earth, I know a guy who will punish him dearly. And that wraps up this episode, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. If you can, be a premium subscriber and help support the channel, I do appreciate it. Podcasting is not free. If you can just like, subscribe, and share it with your friends, that will also help. This has been a Southern Sass production. And until next time, guys, avoid rest stops and be safe.